Story 1. I worked at a payday loan company. It was awful. The business profited from customers' inability to repay loans. Employees were also expected to repossess items. My boss told me I should start carrying a gun for protection. Story 2. 50 years ago, I worked part of a summer in Alaska during the salmon run in a salmon canning factory. I often worked 16-hour days because when they were hauling in so much fish, it had to be processed very quickly. One of my jobs was to collect dented cans from the assembly line, open them with a hand-operated can opener, pour the boiled salmon into undamaged cans, and put them back on the assembly line. I would leave at 1 a.m., which was full daylight, and with my clothes literally stiff with fish juices, I would walk back to my camp, followed by dozens of cats. I made a lot of money and never ate fish again. Story 3. Pressure washing chicken houses in winter, 6 days a week. Covered head to toe in chicken matter, barely able to breathe with a wet rag over your mouth and nose, the wretched stench of feces and carcasses everywhere. Cold and wet, dragging 50 to 100 yards of hose back and forth, removing decayed, stuck chicken bodies from metal grates. So much worse than trash collection. Story 4. While picking daffodils, I bent over all day. My feet turned outward because of the mounds on either side of the row I was picking. I could barely walk after 2 weeks. Thankfully, another employer called, and I never went back. Story 5. I was a roustabout in the oil fields in California in the 1980s. I still have post-traumatic stress disorder from that experience 40 years later. There were so many close calls. Story 6. I worked in telephone sales when I was 18. It lasted a week and I quit. My dad, who grew up during the Depression and believed there was no such thing as a bad job, listened to my reasons and agreed with my decision. Story 7. I took a nannying job for a wealthy family. The mother was condescending and extremely critical. I quit after 2 weeks. Story 8. I once applied for an assistant sales manager position. I went in for what I thought was an interview, and they put me to work immediately. They paired me with another man and we went to local parking lots, selling items from the trunk of the car, including speakers, watches, and other items. I quit about 2 hours into it. Story 9. I was a personal assistant to an incredibly rich family. Their attitude, "We can do whatever the hell we want because we own everything and everyone," went far beyond what I am comfortable disclosing. Story 10. I worked in customer service for a medical insurance company. Calls were limited to 2 minutes, and you were reprimanded for volunteering information beyond the customer's question. Bathroom breaks were strictly scheduled unless you were pregnant. You were told never to admit a mistake. The rules for the various insurance policies and for the company were extremely complex, and the performance metrics created excessive stress. Teams competed to produce better statistics each day and each week. It was the only job I ever walked out of. You did not go into customer service to have your boss tell you not to help customers or threaten you with firing. That was what their paranoid rules amounted to. Story 11. I cannot decide whether it was the fast food or retail. Both were terrible and caused medical issues. Story 12. I worked at McDonald's for 7 years under the Golden Arches. I was treated poorly, cleaned up waste, and was once attacked by a person under the influence of drugs. Story 13. I was a farm worker. I liked the job for the most part, but it involved planting potatoes. It was an organic farm, so the only fertilizer we used was semi-composted chicken manure. It was spread liberally over the fields we were planting. Planting potatoes involved sitting on the back of a machine attached to a tractor. The machine had 2 large hoppers full of potatoes and 2 rotating arms with needles that would grab the potatoes as they fell out of a chute and place them in the ground at regular intervals. Another farm worker and I made sure every needle had a potato on it. No, we were not issued personal protective equipment except nitrile gloves, which were thinner than a dollar store condom. It had been dry for a week after the chicken manure was spread, so the field was incredibly dusty. I was continually grabbing potatoes out of the hopper to put on the needles. There were no safety devices on the planter. A potato split as my coworker was placing it, and the needle impaled his hand. Fortunately, the chain came off, preventing his hand from being pulled further, but his hand was still jammed in the chute. I jumped off to get the farmer to stop. I did not know about the injury. I only knew the chain was off. He was a guest worker and a Vietnam veteran who did not speak English. The farmer noticed he was not getting off the machine and was going to yell at him until he saw his arm. I ran to the farmhouse to call emergency services and returned just as the farmer freed my coworker's arm. You could see through the hole. The ambulance came and I went home. I coughed up at least a pound of manure dust. My coworker was back to work the next week on light duty. He still had his hand, which was almost miraculous considering how much manure had been embedded in the wound. Story 14. I was an assistant manager at Walgreens a few years ago. I worked day, afternoon, and night shifts that changed almost every week, so I never felt rested. I worked holidays and weekends, handled all the complaints, and filled in for employees who called in. I was transferred frequently. I lasted a little over a year. It was the only time I quit a job without notice and without another job lined up. It gives me the willies just thinking about it. Story 15. I strung tennis rackets. It was hard on my hands, so I didn't last long. Story 16. I think I win. I worked as a casino dealer and later in table games management. However, during the coronavirus disease 2019 pandemic, my casino closed, and I found a job cleaning up homicide and suicide scenes directly for the police department. The pay was good. The stories, the smells, the memories, and the visuals are extremely depressing and graphic, and can turn anyone into an alcoholic or a drug user. People do not understand. People die all the time. People are sometimes found weeks or months after the fact. Within 24 hours, the body begins to decompose. Internal fluids and gases begin to escape. After that, we have to tear up the flooring and continue cleaning. Blood and internal fluids spread quickly. Story 17. Dishwasher. Received no respect, was poorly paid, the job was unpleasant, and the bosses were unsupportive. Story 18. I spent about 6 months digitizing video and audio interviews with survivors of the Second Congo War and the Rwandan genocide. Story 19. Bottling wine in southern France. Large wineries would hire an outfit like ours to bottle in the summer after the grape harvest. The crew would arrive in an 18-wheeler with an assembly line in the trailer. Pallets of empty wine bottles would be waiting for us. I was the newcomer placed at the start of the line to manually load bottles onto the conveyor belt. The trick was to put a bottle between each finger of both hands and load as fast as possible. Shifts started at 4 a.m. and did not end until 10 p.m., sometimes midnight. Bottles would shatter often on the line, wine spilling because of the speed of the line. I cannot recall the exact cause. The line would stop, the foreman would yell at me, and I would have to sweep up glass, sometimes without gloves. Glass shards would cut my hands and face, and we had no goggles. Then the line would start again. There was no occupational safety and health administration oversight in France. I was so bad at the beginning that the foreman hated me. He would pull me off the line and assign me to box duty, preparing cardboard boxes to be packed. A pallet of cardboard boxes would take an hour. There were sometimes up to 4 pallets. I would come home with messed up, bloody hands covered in blisters and reeking of wine. I did this for a whole summer. I was 18 and barely made enough to buy a used car. I also have messed up stories about the grape harvest. When I hear people talk at length about wine, I grit my teeth and walk away. It was brutal work and thankless. It made me hate wine. Stay in school, kids. Story 20. Shelf stocking at Walmart. Treated like a slave. Working from 2 to 11 p.m. for $11 per hour. Story 21. Folding laundry in a county jail honor farm for 25 cents a day. Story 22. At age 14 to 15, I spent the entire summer vacation, about 2 months, helping build a house for a family member. That summer had unusually strong sun and the worksite had no shade. My tasks included loading bricks into a wheelbarrow, carrying them about 20 meters, stacking them, lifting 50-kilogram cement bags into a cement mixer, shoveling sand into the mixer, loading mixed cement into a wheelbarrow, and shoveling that mix into a container usually located higher up on the building. I repeated these tasks for more than 10 hours every day. I was unpaid and have not spoken to that family member much since. Story 23. After I quit, I have never shopped at Dollar General again. Story 24. When I was 14, a neighbor asked if I wanted to work at her hamburger stand in a rundown mall. This was 30 years ago when malls were rarely run down. I was raised by my Depression-era grandparents who believed any job was a good job. It was not. I was the low man on the totem pole, earning minimum wage and doing the menial tasks no one else wanted. It was a situation of putting up with things now because they would get better, as most high school students experienced at the time. Most afternoons and evenings I was just counting down the clock until we closed at 9. I worked there for a year and came home reeking of cigarette smoke after every shift because people could smoke freely in that tiny mall. Too often I was called on Monday and told I was late because my neighbor, a poor manager, did not post the weekly schedule until the first day of the work week. You had to show up on Monday ready to work in case your name was on the schedule. This was before cell phones and widespread email. My grandparents grew tired of me smelling of smoke and of having to drop everything to drive me to and from work on Mondays. They loved golf and Mondays were free for seniors. I took immense pleasure in telling my neighbor I was giving 2 weeks' notice and would not be coming back. Story 25. A convenience store with no air conditioning. The candy bars would flop when you picked them up. Story 26. Call center customer service representative for a national bank. Every first of the month, and on many alternate Fridays and Saturdays, customers who did not understand banking would call, angry because they believed I had stolen their money. We probably need classes in high school to explain this, because many people of all ages did not understand that automatic payments they set up will still withdraw the amount due and can overdraw the account if there are insufficient funds. I worked for a bank that was promoting online banking and its application while phasing out physical branches. Many older and retired customers were unable or unwilling to use the application or website, even though it was designed so a small child could use the basic functions. There are only so many times you can tell someone to press the green sign and button after entering their password, which is just below the password field, and then watch them refresh the page instead before you lose your composure. Story 27. I was the sole graphic designer for a trade show company. I learned a lot, but it was a toxic environment. I worked 60 to 70 hours a week, including weekends and holidays, and I even worked during scheduled paid time off. 3 co-workers were advised by their therapists to quit, and 2 had their therapy paid for by the company. I was eventually fired over a social media post, a doodle of a broken flying robot head with the caption, "I quit." I do a lot of doodling and do not remember why I drew it. Story 28. I worked in a glass factory where the building was about 115 degrees Fahrenheit most of the year. I worked 12-hour days, 5 days a week, plus 3 to 4 hours on many Saturdays. There was constant aggression and frequent cuts even while wearing full protective gear in that heat. Pay was low. The only benefit was that the work left me physically very fit. Story 29. I was lumping raw fiberglass wool. Our protective clothing was a pair of cotton garden gloves. I worked 1 shift and quit. It was an infamous easy-to-get job out of high school. Half my friends worked there, but only for a few hours. The longest I heard was one guy who stayed 2 weeks before quitting. Story 30. I used to work a second job driving a van for a transport company that served railroads. I would pick up train crews, drop them off, or sometimes do both. The setup of the job was terrible for multiple reasons. I had to call whenever I picked up a crew, when I dropped them off, and when I returned to the station. But I was put on hold for over an hour, fairly consistently, so I stopped doing anything except calling in the final drop-off. I also had to call just to be registered as on duty. I would get one job and then be shifted to the bottom of the queue, and then I had to call to be registered as off-duty, and they would still call me even if I was off-duty. This was not the old days, it was 2021. You need an application. I did not formally quit. I just stopped calling. Story 31. I worked 6 days a week, 10-hour days, making nearly identical phone calls. I would call people and tell them they had forgotten to submit some paperwork and offer to send it for them to sign and return. Before anyone claims I was in Calcutta scamming people, I was actually working for the United States federal government. Story 32. I worked at Chili's for one day. During orientation, they told me that they are required by law to give breaks, but no one takes them there, and if I took one, I would be the only person doing so. I should have walked out then, but I stayed for one shift. The man training me spoke very little English, and I speak very little Spanish. He showed me what to do for about an hour before disappearing to who knows where, and I had to work alone for hours. Eventually, I was exhausted, hungry, and just wanted to sit down, so I did. People gave me strange looks. After the shift, the men who had trained me returned and showed me how to clean everything. There was an implied expectation that I would be able to do it by myself the next shift. I told the manager that the job was not for me and that it would be my last day. Story 33. I worked at a factory making rubber seals. I was only there for 3 months, but it was terrible. I was fired on the last day of my probation period for not showing enough commitment. 55 hours a week was not enough. Story 34. I worked as a lunch lady in an elementary school cafeteria. I hated every minute of that job. A child spat in my face once. I was ready to dance with joy when I was fired. Story 35. At 15, working at Popeyes, I picked residual feathers and scraped livers from frozen boxes of chickens while standing in the freezer and running them under cold water. A close second was cleaning the plastic serving bins for mashed potatoes that many restaurants use. Story 36. It's a tie between Kmart and Keek's Breakfast Cafe. Both are big in Florida. Keek's had the most toxic kitchen I have ever worked in. The manager and the owner had a terrible attitude and were very rude. He fired the same guy who trained me after 3 days, right in front of me. That guy was pretty, chill, and had children to support. I felt like the manager was playing chess with me, and I really hated that. After he fired the man, he said, "Don't worry, feminist duelist. You and Chris are my main guys now." I did not believe him and stopped showing up the day after the firing. Kmart is self-explanatory. Story 37. Phone surveys that called random people in the United States to determine radio ratings were terrible. Story 38. I worked as a gas station cashier. It was a second job and I was exhausted from my first job. The work was mind-numbing. Story 39. Exterminator. I lasted 20 minutes into the first job. So many roaches. Story 40. I collected milk samples at a dairy for one shift. Put me off milk forever. I am not sure whether all dairies are that unsanitary or if this one was just poorly managed. The number of flies was like a biblical plague. Story 41. I worked in the management office of a mall. I regularly worked nights and weekends, but it was a salary job, so there was no overtime. After I left, both of my bosses were fired for violating anti-bullying laws. I got a lot of free cookies from Great American Cookie, though. Story 42. I worked at a poultry processing plant. I had to squeeze turkey carcasses very hard. The boss saw my misery and assigned me to the folding line, folding the legs into the body cavity. At the end of the day, we could not feel our thumbs. Story 43. Working the McDonald's fryer is not bad. It is repetitive and hot, and time absolutely crawls. Story 44. I manually pushed fiberglass roll insulation into huge ducts, the size of a room to a small house. I did not know what they were for, but I assumed they were for large building heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems to contain heat. At the start of a 12-hour shift, we wore paper suits and taped all the arm and leg openings. We wore gloves and face masks. It was hot and unpleasant. I always showered right when I got home, but my clothes and skin were still itchy even with the suits on. They had pecan fruit pies in the vending machine. I loved them and never saw them again after that job. To the other person who bought them before I had a chance to get them all from the machine. Screw you. Story 45. Worked as a telemarketer for one day in the mid-1980s. We were selling light bulbs and were required to tell the potential customer that we were disabled workers. I am not disabled. I could not stomach that level of deception, so I never came back. Story 46. I had 8 jobs. I hated every minute of every job. I worked 39 years, then retired. I am so happy now. Story 47. Walmart delicatessen. The hours were 3 in the morning to 12 noon. The customers were often unpleasant and made offensive remarks that denied the value of adoption. I also had to handle unappealing raw meat products. 0 out of 10. I would not do it again. Story 48. I worked at Arby's in Lubbock near the university for about 3 hours. Story 49. I was certified in cool sculpting and helped people lose weight and perform non-invasive body contouring treatments. It was the worst job ever. The clinic was so money-hungry that they told us to do things that were against our training and very dangerous just to save money. It was absolutely awful. I am now afraid to go to other medical spas or similar places. People beware. Story 50. I worked at Macy's, a mid to upper scale department store in California, during one holiday season as a second job. Everything was awful. People can be terrible. The job I thought I would hate was the summer I spent working at a pet cemetery. It was one of the most heartwarming experiences. People can be kind in ways you cannot anticipate, and it is lovely to see. Story 51. I worked on deck my first year in the Navy. We chipped paint, sanded barnacles off boats, and painted everything. We had to wear stinky life vests and were yelled at by everyone. We worked long hours and slept in tiny coffin beds. We had to stand at attention, and if one person made a mistake, we all got in trouble. The food was bad, the uniforms were hot, and we had to stand watch overnight after working all day, then work the next day with no sleep. It was hell on earth. Story 52. When I was in college, I did temporary jobs through an agency during the summers. One time I worked in a drug testing lab, pouring urine samples from containers into test tubes. It paid the most, but I lasted only a week. Story 53. In the 1990s, I worked at the office of a t-shirt company that sold shirts for $20 each, which was expensive back then. The shirts were poor quality from the cotton to the stitching and would fall apart the first time they were washed. They were sold primarily at flea markets and small boutiques. Customers were so angry they hunted the company down. My job was to answer the phone and talk in circles to avoid offering refunds or exchanges. I quit as soon as I found a replacement job. Story 54. I think I had the worst job. When I was about 12 or 13, I was given $5 in 1975 or 1976 by my stepdad to clean fresh, liquid cow manure out of a 2-level cattle carrier trailer that attaches to an 18-wheeler or semi-truck. Shoveling was useless because the manure was fresh and not solid. There was urine too, which helped liquefy it if it had been partially solid. The only way to do it was to use a pressure washer, with the spray sometimes blowing back into your face. I ended up doing that 3 times before he found a better driving job elsewhere. Back then, I was not even sure goggles or a respirator were available. I learned a few years later in shop class that goggles existed, but I do not know whether the trucking company provided them. Story 55. I unloaded 80-pound bags by hand from railroad cars onto a flatbed truck during the hot summer for $20 a day. Story 56. Chick-fil-A. I was making minimum wage, the same as the cashiers, but I worked in the back where the work was non-stop and more physical. The owner did not give employees a discounted meal. It was full price, and he would not allow us to get cups for drinks. He only allowed water cones. I quit a month into it. Story 57. I worked at a skating rink in the late 1980s. On Friday nights, kids would drink Mad Dog and vomit colored greens into the urinals. Good times. Story 58. I worked at a wastewater treatment plant. Maybe not the worst, but the nastiest. Story 59. I worked at a pool company helping with scheduling technicians and billing. The customers were horrible. They called and cursed at me constantly. My last straw was a drunk customer calling my personal cell phone at 2 in the morning on a Sunday because his hot tub would not go above 104 degrees Fahrenheit. He called me every name in the book because I would not send a technician immediately. He got my personal number from one of our technician's clipboards. The technician had not given it to him. I quit the next day and had a new job the following Monday. The new job was great. I worked there 6.5 years before becoming a stay-at-home mom. Story 60. It was not the job, it was the manager and certain people. Story 61. Someone told me about it. He went to India and volunteered at an orphanage. His job was to go into the city and look for children to bring back. He had to choose between children who were too damaged and those who were salvageable. He described his job as playing God. Story 62. I never had the job, but some people had to chip frozen urine out of portable toilets in the oil fields of northern Alberta in winter. They used a crowbar and a face shield, then scooped it up and sanitized the area. I've never seen a worse job than chipping out frozen urine at -35 degrees Celsius. Story 63. I fold dog bandanas 8 hours a day. If I ever see them in a store, I have deep empathy for whoever assembled them. Story 64. I worked as a regular rural carrier for the United States Postal Service. When I wasn't being blamed by customers for stealing mail and parcels, my boss tried to show me his penis. My first experience with him was while I was on leave under the Family and Medical Leave Act for a radical bilateral mastectomy for breast cancer. He had been newly hired while I was undergoing radiation therapy and sent me a certified letter saying I would be fired if I did not return within 2 weeks. When I returned, he called me into his office several times a week immediately after he had obviously been masturbating. He also showed pictures of his penis to the women in the office, asking whether it looked normal. I contacted my steward and the United States Postal Inspection Service. Nothing happened, so I left. I hear from former coworkers that he is still there doing the same things. Story 65. I worked in human resources at a cannabis dispensary. The owners were the worst. I knew I had made a mistake when they hung a Trump flag, a shirtless image of him on a horse, in the workplace in 2020. I once got in trouble for using company resources to put tampons in the women's restroom that was for employees and used by around 10 women. It was retail chaos like any other retail job, and the cannabis did not make it any better. Story 66. I was an intern at a parking machine company. Story 67. I had a job with several roles. One of them was janitorial. I had to clean the bathrooms, which was unpleasant. Story 68. Working in the Walmart deli or in the medical records call center has caused me to hate people and to realize how many people truly cannot read. Story 69. My first graphic design job was soul-sucking and I should have left sooner. Set my career back. When they let me go after 8 years, I finally realized how badly they had treated me. They did not give raises and used a monthly quota with a bonus for anything above it. That sounded fair, except the work was seasonal. When we got busy, they put us on overtime and raised the quota. When work slowed, the overtime disappeared and the quota stayed higher. After 8 years, I was earning less than when I was hired right out of college. I was so naive. Story 70. I hated United Parcel Service. I shoveled literal shit in the middle of summer and would rather do that than work another hour loading trucks for the company. I didn't mind delivering, but loading sucked. Story 71. I made ranch in 5-gallon buckets at Mazzio's. It was disgusting. Story 72. I'm sorry you went through that. Are you safe right now? If you are at immediate risk, please call your local emergency number right now, for example, 911 in the US. If you are in the United States or Canada, you can call or text 988 for the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. In the United Kingdom and Ireland, Samaritans are at 116 123. In Australia, Lifeline is 13 11 14. If you are elsewhere, please contact your local emergency services or a nearby crisis line. If you are not in immediate danger and would like me to edit the sentence for Azure text-to-speech now, I can do that. Shall I proceed? Story 73. Loan processing is even worse than working in a call center. I have done both. Imagine somebody dumping 50 puzzles into a punch bowl and telling you that you have 1 hour to put them all together. Meanwhile, your phone is ringing off the hook with people who are angry because they do not have their money yet. And 3 levels of management are constantly breathing down your neck and doing everything in their power to make your job more difficult. Story 74. I lasted 1 day at a job that made bulletproof glass for military vehicles. I helped prepare it for shipment and slit my thumb wide open. I did not go back. Story 75. Caregiver at an assisted living facility. I will never work anywhere I have to deal with poop. Story 76. I have never hated my life as much as I did while working at Walmart. Every shift was soul-crushing. Story 77. Dishwasher and kitchen gopher in a Hungarian cuisine restaurant. Story 78. Construction estimator. The training was a joke. The work culture was insufferable, and I immediately became the scapegoat for our poor sales. I quit after 4 months. I missed the salary, but that is about it. Story 79. Old Navy. My round-trip commute was about an hour and a half. There were many days when, 30 minutes into my shift, they tell me they didn't need me anymore, meaning I lost money on gas. Folding clothes for 6 to 8 hours straight is mind-numbingly boring. Some customers would see that I had just folded an entire table's worth of clothes and then walk over and mess up the table, unfolding everything. Story 80. McDonald's. It was not the job or the staff. I met some of the best people there. The number of times I was spoken to as if I were a piece of trash was alarming. It was even worse on night shifts because intoxicated customers would come in trying to start fights. Story 81. I worked on the bins for 1 day, laughing out loud. I went around on a truck emptying bins. The hours went very slowly, and I was physically exhausted. Story 82. I worked at Walmart in a red state at the height of the pandemic. Several people purposely coughed and spat on me for wearing a mask and gloves, and others yelled that I was scaring people. Both my mother and I have weakened immune systems, so I was trying not to bring anything home. All my coworkers got sick at least once. Some of the older ones never fully recovered and had to retire. I started covering more and more areas, even though I was already spread thin. I got sick 3 times. The first time was the worst. I had pneumonia-like symptoms I could not shake. I was told I was too young and healthy to be tested, yet I was still not allowed to work because of my symptoms. My boss called me every day, yelled, and insinuated I was faking. I had rapid fever spikes and severe lung pain. I could not get anyone to listen, examine my throat, or test me for influenza. I feared I would die from something that would normally be treated quickly because of coronavirus disease 2019. When I finally returned, I was essentially punished for being gone so long. They gave me worse tasks and cut my hours until I had enough and found another job. Story 83. This was back in the 1980s during summer break from college. My friend got a job putting up the big tent poles used for events and festivals, some 12 by 12 up to 50 feet or more. It was the hardest job he had ever done. It was all manual labor, no machines. This was during a heat wave and drought. At the same time, I was painting a factory rooftop with silver paint to help reflect the sun. You could see the heat waves in front of you. It was one of the worst jobs, but still not the absolute worst. The worst job ever was at a frozen pizza factory in Ohio. Some of the jobs were so mundane they could drive you nuts. One day they had us watching a machine spot on the conveyor belt where trays could jam up. Right in front of you was a random clock. That clock made time stand still. I was hired through a temp service and earned more than the regular employees. I couldn't help thinking the job was the worst, but I also made more money. That pizza job had so many stories that would be hard to take day after day. Now here is the thing. Some months I work almost 450 hours for my business. I'm not afraid to work on anything, whether it's putting on a roof, plumbing, engine and car repair, landscaping, painting, and so on. But that pizza factory was just depressing. The people working there were okay, but the different jobs they had to do made it terrible. I was contracted for 2 weeks, I worked hard, and they even asked if I would like to be hired on. I politely declined. I feel for those folks every day. Story 84. All of them. The first real job was as a civilian engineer with the Army. I was 17 and was molested by 2 different supervisors. Nothing came of it. Working in an adult store was terrible for obvious reasons. It was in a strip mall that shared a wall with Subway. The smell soaked everything and I brought it home with me. At the paint store, I faced crushing sexism and developed crushed discs in my back. Courier work was rough. Driving across town during rush hour to make $4, with the stress of driving more than 8 hours every day and eating junk food. I worked at a dress shop that catered specifically to bridal parties. I had to touch people all day and tell anyone over size 14 that we had nothing for them to try on. Being a cashier was awful. People yelled, paid with a sticky handful of nickels, and argued about prices and discounts. It was the constant standing in one place that made me quit. Other jobs included a pet store, a print company, a head shop, a dry cleaner, a car wash, and screen printing. All the office jobs I had were bad mainly because of politics, cliques, poor management, and unsafe practices. Story 85. I was a system administrator at a managed service provider. It was a poorly managed situation with an awful work-life balance and poor pay. Story 86. I have had a couple that really sucked, not because of the actual job but because of horrible bosses. Story 87. The Denny's where I worked was poorly managed and unpleasant. The other servers would roll dirty silverware instead of sorting it and running it through the dishwasher like civilized people. Story 88. Telemarketer. Long hours each day spent getting yelled at on the phone. Story 89. Framing carpentry for house building is paid hourly. There are no benefits, no paid time off, and no pay for rainy days. The work is physically demanding in all weather, and income can be uncertain during slowdowns. Story 90. I worked at a call center for an electricity company when I was fresh out of high school. That job sucked. Story 91. I did job training at a bargain outlet store where I removed items from boxes, applied price stickers, and returned them to the boxes. It was too easy. Story 92. I work nights stocking groceries and have an imbalanced life. Laughing out loud. Story 93. I was the forklift operator at a pallet repair plant. It was nothing but crackheads and jailbirds, and one person was allegedly a pedophile. The facility was open to the elements, and the pay was extremely poor. Story 94. Telemarketing was like a call center job, but you had to lie to people and obtain their credit card information. Story 95. Concrete foundations. I do not mind physical work, but that was awful. Working outside was enjoyable even in winter. Story 96. Supermarket butchery. I'll never work there again. It's soul-destroying. Story 97. I worked as a computer service technician at a defunct Canadian big-box electronics store. It was the lowest-paying job I have ever had. There was no commission, and I earned minimum wage of $5.50 per hour at the time. Story 98. I worked for a company that counted inventory for other companies. Most shifts started at 11 p.m. or midnight and lasted 2 to 7 hours. Sometimes I was scheduled to work at 8 a.m. the next morning. I have had nothing but great jobs since then. Story 99. I worked the graveyard shift in the mailroom at Target Corporation, previously Dayton Hudson, operating a machine that opened credit card payments rejected by the larger automated mail opener. Story 100. Being a special needs teaching assistant was the most rewarding and draining job I ever had. The children were wonderful and made the work worthwhile, but it was heartbreaking to see little or no progress. They often needed help to pick up a plastic spoon or to say their own names. That job drained me. Story 101. Hauling steel 55-gallon drums. Took about 4 hours to load the drums in the Texas heat. Inside the trailer, it was 120 degrees. I would roll about 10 at a time, climb in, and stack them. They were hot and covered with chemicals. Approximately 420, plus or minus, fit in a trailer. After loading, we drove 10 hours to the cleaning facility. Story 102. Door-to-door sales. Being rejected repeatedly all day gets to you, even if you know it is coming. Story 103. The kindergarten through 12th grade online school program is great, but I was hired as an enrollment consultant and I should have known from the title that it was basically a sales position, even though it was a free service. I am not good at persuading people. I am a straight yes or no person, and it did not go well. I lasted only 11 months. It was a very difficult experience. Story 104. I was doing temporary work and was assigned to grounds maintenance in a public housing area. I had to clean up crack baggies and needles. I did not return after lunch. Story 105. It wasn't the worst job specifically, but the position I'd ended up in. I was at a social game studio as a producer, designer, writer, artist, animator, art tech, a jack of all trades. I kept taking on more and more responsibility, and eventually I was doing the work of 5 people. It was garbage. So I stepped down. I said I was going to hide in a corner and make art and let other people manage things. The producer they hired to replace me was incompetent and obnoxious. He repeatedly asked how long it takes to make a hidden object scene, 5 days, and he asked the same questions every week for over a year. Every time I started talking to a designer, writer, or artist, he would pop up and ask, "Do I need to be in on this discussion?" No, we were talking about a different game. He did not need to be involved. At the beginning, we were all in one big room together, and slowly we all found offices to share until he was alone in a giant room. He kept looking over our shoulders and butting into conversations. He didn't understand how the code worked, so he'd make decisions and change things, and then quality assurance or the coders would come to me and say he'd done something wrong. I had to figure out what he did and why, and then lose my temper with the owner of the company to get it undone. Usually this happened because I could communicate between programmers and non-technical staff and could see where things went wrong. They had made something trigger every time for testing. When it was ready to go live, the producer said it shouldn't trigger every time. It was a bug and they didn't have time or resources to debug it, so they wanted to scrap the feature. Quality assurance came to me saying this was happening and that it was insane. I checked with a programmer and found the trigger was just a number in the database set to 100. Changing it to the desired frequency, like 15%, fixed it. It was a 20-second fix. I wasn't allowed to actually step down. I kept having to save this guy's mistakes. Story 106. Making plastic windshield ice scrapers in the middle of the summer for minimum wage. Story 107. Installing ceiling insulation was difficult. I am tall, not thin. I was not overweight but carried some extra weight, so crawling in the ceiling was a nightmare. Story 108. My current job is on a production line, working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Story 109. I worked on a chicken farm one summer. It smelled awful and there was a lot of abuse toward the birds, but I was told it was normal. It was terrible. Story 110. Dishwasher. There were a lot of factors. It was far from home and far from the kitchen, so I felt lonely. There were almost never any dishes, so it was very boring. More than anything, it was the smell, the awful smell. Everyone I know who has worked as a dishwasher agrees there is a horrible smell. I've been pretty lucky, so in the grand scheme that isn't so bad. Story 111. Being a part-time janitor at Jack LaLanne Gym in the Bronx during the mid-1980s, I discovered that the female locker room was far worse to clean than the men's locker room. I will not go into what I discovered, but let us say that if I lie on a psychiatrist's couch, I might learn why I am a confirmed bachelor in my 60s. Story 112. I worked in a bank call center. I was young and had just finished working at a nonprofit for 3 years when the program lost its funding. My mother begged me to get a real job, so I took one at the bank. For 3 months I hated it. I was not good at it. This was the pre-internet era, and most of my calls were from people who were drunk at 2 a.m., had lost their bank cards, and needed cash for a taxi home. Story 113. As a teenager, I worked as a construction laborer. The owner had a farm where we met before riding to the site. When I arrived, I was told the site was closed, but there was work cleaning out sheep stalls. I thought, how bad could it be? As soon as my pitchfork hit the straw, the stench was unbelievable. After I stopped gagging, I worked for 4 hours and cleared the stalls. Then I walked into his house and quit on the spot. Story 114. I sold used office furniture in a windowless building 6 days a week. I worked there for about 4 months, but it felt like 4 years. Story 115. It was a sales call center, but not the modern kind with computers, dialers, and headsets. We used landline telephones in the 1990s, received an address list, and were told to call people and offer a new insurance package. I quit after 2 days. It was not worth the paycheck. Story 116. Pushed carts and worked as a grocery bagger in a Chicago winter. The job lasted 2 days. Story 117. I worked on an automotive parts manufacturing assembly line, putting covers on shock absorbers. It was the 3rd shift. I left at the first break and never looked back. Story 118. After working in fast food, specifically at McDonald's, I will never work there again. Story 119. I worked at a popular chain that designs fruit bouquets. I worked one 3-hour shift and never went back. I understand they had standards, but they were screaming at me and the two other employees who were training with me. They discarded so much product. It was extremely wasteful. The chain craft store was also terrible, mainly because of the customer base. They wanted us to aggressively push credit cards, which I was not willing to do. Story 120. Loading an entire field of 80-pound hay bales onto a flatbed truck in 90-degree heat. Story 121. Make-ready assistant for an apartment complex. I helped the crew who painted and did electrical work and so on to get apartments ready. I did not have those skills. I was a teenager there to do the heavy lifting. I ripped up old, nasty carpet and hauled it out or went into refrigerators that had been without power for weeks to remove unidentifiable items that smelled awful. It was undesirable, dirty work. Looking back, it may not have been entirely legal to have me do that work, but it was the mid-1990s and no one seemed to care. I lasted 2 months. Story 122. I was standing inside an industrial humidifier, knee-deep in water, scraping limescale from the walls. It was 90 degrees Fahrenheit with 100% humidity. Story 123. I will never work as a legal assistant in a cubicle again. Story 124. I worked as a dishwasher at Wags, a restaurant at the Walgreens in the mall. The garbage disposal did not work and my manager acted like a Hitler wannabe. He was short, yelled a lot, and had a tiny mustache. I went to work at the deli next door without telling my managers. The manager came by and bought an iced tea the night I called out. He yelled at me some more when I went to get my last check. I laughed out loud. The deli was fun until the store was bought by a new couple who changed everything. Story 125. I did a few odd jobs for a friend who ran a handyman business that he operated in a shady manner. I never got paid for the last job. Story 126. I was a clerk at a gas station on the edge of town near the highway. I quit the day the police came in at gunpoint to detain a man suspected of multiple heinous crimes. I do not know exactly what they were. Story 127. There is no such thing as a bad job. The bad thing is having to work. Story 128. I was an assistant fire marshal. The job was wonderful, but our boss did everything he could to undermine our work. Pay was stalled, and there was sabotage every week due to jealousy and immature behavior. Work is worthwhile when you have a good crew. It is not the job, but the people you are around. Story 129. The job is never the issue. It is the managers who can be toxic narcissists. I was told, you don't quit a bad job. You quit a bad boss. Until it happened, I did not believe it. Now I swear by it. Story 130. I was a cashier at Whole Foods during the pandemic. I am still not fully mentally and emotionally recovered. What a nightmare. Story 131. Dog Hotel. I am not going to make up random stories about dogs or talk about them as if they were children at daycare. My boss told me I must let owners know how their dog's day went and what they did. No, thank you. Story 132. I have had only one job in my adult life. I have run my own small business for almost 40 years. It is the best thing I have done. Story 133. Administrative assistant at the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. I'm sorry, Lord, but I wasn't ready yet. I messed that all the way up. Story 134. I shoveled fish guts to the seagulls behind a fishery in Provincetown, Massachusetts. I worked a 4-hour morning and never returned after lunch. I still received a wage and tax statement for the half-day. Story 135. The Army can be unkind and rude to people who are new, based on my conversations with others who took jobs there. Story 136. In college, I worked a campus job called Setups. It did exactly what it sounded like. Our job was to set things up. If someone needed furniture assembled or moved on campus, that was our responsibility. The tasks were not bad. Mostly lifting heavy items. The difficult part was the other employees. They were mostly local residents who treated the student employees poorly. They also preferred student employees to work no more than 20 hours a week, which was fine, but they scheduled shifts to maximize the number of separate shifts you had to work. Story 137. I closed the dishwasher at Golden Corral. The restaurant closed at 9 or 10, and we would wash dishes until 2 in the morning. Then the manager would come back and say the morning crew would finish the rest. I worked with one other person in the back. One coworker only spoke German, and the other was deaf from an accident. He could speak fine, but you could not respond without him looking directly at you. It was tough to do for $7.25 an hour for a summer job. I have washed dishes at many other places and have been very happy. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.